We're diving into World War I today, but we're not just going to look at it as a historical event. We're going to treat it like a detective story, a mystery, how a single gunshot could trigger a global explosion that literally redrew the map of the world. And, honestly, left a shadow we're still living in today.
You know, it's so easy to picture 1914 as this ancient, distant time, but here's the crazy thing. It wasn't. The world back then was, in some ways, eerily similar to ours. Europe had been mostly at peace for 100 years. Economies were globalizing, technology was connecting people. There was this feeling that things were, well, pretty stable.
Right? That's the billion-dollar question. How does a world that looks so modern, a world where leaders were actively trying to avoid a major war, how does it just stumble headfirst into one of the most catastrophic conflicts in all of human history? That's the puzzle we're going to try and piece together.
Okay, so to understand the explosion, you've first got to understand the explosives. Europe in the early 1900s wasn't some peaceful garden. It was a powder keg, just packed with tensions that had been simmering and building for decades, waiting for a spark.
To make sense of all this, historians have this really handy acronym, MAIN. The M is for militarism. Think of a massive arms race, especially between Britain and Germany, building bigger and bigger battleships. A is for alliances, this tangled web of promises that basically created two big armed camps. I is for imperialism, all the great powers scrabbling for colonies and resources. And finally, N for nationalism, this intense, often aggressive pride that fueled rivalries.
And if you want to understand the militaristic mindset, just listen to this. This wasn't some random guy. This was Germany's top general in 1912. And he's not warning about war, he's hoping for it. For so many of the era's leaders, war wasn't a last resort. It was seen as a legitimate, even a good tool to achieve their nation's goals.
And these alliances, they basically set up a continental tripwire. You had the Triple Entente, France, Britain, Russia on one side, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on the other. On paper, they were just for defense, if you get attacked, we'll help. But in reality, it meant that one little scuffle between two countries could drag the entire continent into war.
And then you get the spark. The story is just so incredible you couldn't make it up. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting Sarajevo. An assassin throws a bomb, but it misses. The Archduke decides to go visit the people injured by the bomb in the hospital. But his driver, flustered, takes a wrong turn and stalls the car right next to another assassin, Gavrilo Princip, who had basically given up and was grabbing a sandwich. Princip just couldn't believe his luck. He steps up, fires 2 shots, and lights the fuse on the powder keg.
What happens next is this absolutely catastrophic domino effect. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia for the assassination and declares war. Russia, who's the protector of Serbia, starts mobilizing its massive army. Germany sees this, freaks out, and declares war on Russia and on Russia's ally France. Then, to get to France, Germany invades neutral Belgium, which forces Britain to declare war on Germany. In about a week, all of Europe is at war. It's that fast.
But the war that everyone stumbled into, it was nothing like anyone expected. The generals were all thinking in terms of 19th century cavalry charges and grand maneuvers. But the soldiers were armed with the brutal, efficient killing machines of the 20th century.
And the result of that mismatch was this: trench warfare. Pretty soon, a solid line of muddy, rat-infested trenches stretched all the way from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. And for 4 years, millions of men would live and die in these ditches, fighting over a few hundred yards of shattered earth.
To really get your head around the horror of it, all you need is this one number: 50,000. That's roughly how many British soldiers were killed or wounded on the very first day of the Battle of the Somme. In one day. The scale of the slaughter is it's almost impossible to comprehend.
So why was the death toll so astronomical? Well, it was because of this tragic mismatch. I mean, you literally had the French army marching into battle in 1914 wearing bright blue and red uniforms, packed together in columns. They marched right into German machine guns that could fire hundreds of rounds a minute. It was just industrialized slaughter.
And the technology just got more and more terrifying. Both sides started using chemical weapons, chlorine gas, mustard gas. It earned the conflict a grim nickname, the Chemists' War. And while gas wasn't the biggest killer, the psychological terror it created, and the hundreds of thousands of men it left with horrific, lifelong injuries, it was a new kind of hell.
Okay, so you have this unbelievably brutal stalemate. How was it ever broken? Well, the war became this global chess match, and a few key moves ended up changing the entire board.
So a few things really shifted the tide. In 1915, Italy actually switched sides and joined the Allies, which opened up another front. But the real game-changing year was 1917. The United States finally entered the war, bringing fresh troops and supplies. At almost the same time, though, Russia dropped out after the Bolshevik Revolution, which let Germany move all its troops to the west. The final nail in the coffin was in late 1918, when a massive Allied attack called the 100 Days Offensive finally broke the back of the German army.
And we have to remember, this wasn't just a war between armies. It became what historians call a total war. That means entire societies were mobilized. Women flooded into the factories to build shells and guns. Economies were completely retooled for the war effort. The line between soldier and civilian started to completely blur.
So, the fighting finally stopped on November 11, 1918. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the war's end was really just the beginning of a whole new set of problems, and they all centered around the peace treaty that was supposed to fix everything.
This quote, it's just chillingly accurate. It's from Marshal Foch, the top Allied commander. He looked at the Treaty of Versailles, the document that officially ended the war, and he basically said, "This isn't peace. We've just hit the pause button for 20 years." And he was right.
And when you look at the terms, you can see why he said that. Germany was forced to accept 100% of the blame for the war. They had to pay reparations that would be billions in today's money. Their military was dismantled, and they lost huge chunks of territory. For Germans, it wasn't a peace treaty. It felt like a national humiliation, and that feeling of resentment festered for years.
Now, to be fair, there was one big idealistic idea in the treaty, the League of Nations. It was supposed to be a global club where countries could talk out their problems instead of fighting. A great idea, right? But it was doomed from the start. It had no army to enforce its decisions, and key countries, like the United States, never even joined. It was basically powerless.
So the treaty didn't just punish Germany. It completely shattered the old world. It left behind a legacy of political chaos, redrawn maps, and a deep human trauma that would haunt the rest of the century. Just try to wrap your head around this. In just a few years, 4 massive ancient empires, the German, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman, were just gone, wiped off the map. And in their place, the victors drew new countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, often lumping together ethnic groups who didn't get along, creating brand new conflicts that, in some cases, we're still dealing with today.
But beyond the big political changes, you have the human cost. An entire generation was just broken by this war. This account from a veteran, it's haunting. It gives you just a tiny glimpse into the kind of psychological trauma, what they called shell shock, that millions of men carried home with them, if they came home at all.
And that really is the question we're left with. The guns fell silent over 100 years ago, but when you look at the borders in the Middle East, when you think about how the resentment from that war fueled the rise of ideologies that led straight into an even deadlier war, you have to wonder, did the Great War ever really end? Or are we all still living in its long, dark shadow?